Welcome to DejaVue.
Your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. Today we've got a special episode for you. We're going to take a look at all of the previous guests that we've had on and take a look at what their opinions are on the composition API versus the options API.
Exactly. We had a lot of interesting takes there from people saying, oh yeah, composition API, that's the only API that I've ever used and it's so amazing compared to the options API. And also other people saying composition API, tricky. So yeah, we're here for all of them. So let's get started straight away.
Up next, the person whose opinion you maybe want to hear most is Evan, who created the composition API and also the options API, of course. And he has some very interesting opinions and takes on the differences between the two. How was that transition from Vue 2 to Vue 3, along with the composition API and all of that?
Yeah, I think so. Vue 2 to Vue 3 is definitely probably the most challenging and grueling process or period I've experienced in the whole 10 years of working on Vue. I think even to this day there are still lingering just like arguments about options versus composition. It just takes a very, very long time for the community to move on, right? So kind of want to go back to why we started the idea about composition API in the first place, right? So one of the big issues in Vue 2 is TypeScript support isn't quite there. So options API, when it was designed, didn't really even take type inference in mind. So it wasn't really designed in a way to be easily type friendly, especially with mixings. Mixings are extremely hard to type properly. So nowadays in Vue 3, if you use options API with mixing, we can actually infer most of the stuff, which is amazing. But if you look at the types that we had to write to get mixings infer properly, it's just so much extra effort compared to composition API where everything is just functions. It just naturally works with TypeScript, has better type inference performance. It's easier to reason about in type land in most cases. Right? So that's one of the things that kind of pushed us to think about a different API that is designed with type inference in mind. Unfortunately, we can't just get rid of options API, so we have to carry along the burden of all the types that we wrote for options API. But in a way, like we want a new API that's just more type friendly from the get-go. And also, mixings is like the bane of both maintainability and type inference, right? It's hard to infer types. Also, for users, if you use a bunch of mixings, you don't even know where these properties come from, right? So really wanted a API that enables better logic reuse compared to mixings, and also wanted the API to allow people to have a more higher upper ceiling in how to organize your code, right? Options API forces you to group everything by type. So if we go back to like single file components, when it first came out, there were a bunch of people who were like, oh, you're mixing 3 different languages in a single file. Where is separation of concern, right? This very old argument about you should have 3 directories, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and put all your files in these 3 categories. That's like options API to me nowadays, right? So when you transition over to thinking about components, a component is a unit, self-contained unit that contains the cross-cutting concerns from all 3 different layers, but they are related to the same unit of logical concern. And composition API essentially gives you the ability to think about all your logic in the same way. So instead of thinking about here's data, here's computer, here's methods, it's like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can now choose to cut a piece of it out and say, here's a composable. It has all the things that's related to this specific logical concern. I can move it anywhere I want. I can put it inside my component. I can move it outside of the component and share it between multiple components. Or I can even extract it into a library and share with other people, share with other projects. I think that's super powerful. And you can do that while having proper type inference all the way through. And you never get lost with where a property comes from because they always get returned from function calls. You can always just go to definition and you see exactly how they are created. So all of these just adds up to the overall maintainability of large projects, which we've seen over the years. People just struggle with Options API. Like, I think a lot of proponents of Options API really I think it works for them. It's great because their project just isn't huge, right? There is a scaling limit to Options API where if you have a huge project, multiple people working on, you have a component that's hundreds of lines long, it's not going to be fun. It's just not. But with Composition API, I think people don't realize is it's kind of like building, some like a model kit. One version is it only has a fixed way of putting it together, and you have to strictly follow the instructions. So you don't need to use too much of your brain. You just follow all the instructions, and things falls into place, and you have something. But that's the only thing you can build. And if you follow the instruction, that's the only outcome that's possible, right? But on the other hand, if you're something like Lego, you can use your creativity a bit more. But if you don't use your brain, you just randomly put things together, it's going to be a mess. But if you use your brain and think about a design, and you think about, I'm going to build this nice piece of Lego. Now you can use your creativity to build something that's probably better than an off-the-shelf, thing that you can think of, right? So the upper ceiling is higher without Composition API. And I also compare that to writing Composition API code is more similar to writing normal JavaScript, right?
Definitely.
Right. So it's like if you write messy code with Composition API, you probably write messy code with normal JavaScript modules too, because you don't think about how to group your variables and your functions together. How do you make abstractions? How do you split out modules? Right? You think about all that when you're writing normal JavaScript. Composition API kind of forces you to think about these same concerns. You're writing Vue component code. So that is indeed a lot more you need to think about compared to Options API. But that also allows you to apply all your JavaScript skills in terms of how do you write nice abstractions? How do you organize code neatly? How do you make them maintainable? All these skills that's applicable to writing good JavaScript now apply to writing good Composition API code, right? So in a way, if you are a good JavaScript developer, you will find Composition API more, liberating, because now you can fully leverage your skills as a JavaScript developer, right? But I also understand if you don't want to just spend time thinking about writing good JavaScript code, I want to just get my hands held all the time. I don't want to think, right? Options API might still be a better fit, but as I said, Vue's user base changed over time. We now have real Vue users who are trying to build really complex stuff. And maybe they are really good skilled developers who can write really well-maintained JavaScript code. So it would be a pity if we lock them into the upper ceiling created by Options API forever, right? So in a way, my motivation is to create this alternative API that unlocks that ceiling for them, right? So unfortunately, to some users, it might not be the most ideal trade-off because they probably never hit that ceiling. So to them, Composition API is just something overhead. I don't need, right? Yeah. Overhead, right? Which is unfortunate, but I think it's a result of Vue's user base being really, really diverse. And tough decisions have to be made. We try to make sure that the existence of Composition API won't affect how your Options API code works, right? In fact, you can even easily leverage composables used by other people if you still prefer to write options, right? You just use the setup hook and you can still use composables. So we definitely tried our best to find the right balance. I think it's just it's not quite possible to make everything perfect for everyone. Someone will complain, but I think we tried our best. I'm pretty happy with the outcome in general. I think Composition API achieved all the goals that we set out to do. It had better TypeScript support. It unlocked logic reuse and composition. It increased the maintainability ceiling, right? It spawned projects like Vue Use, and it's now the preferred way to write components for most new users. So I think we achieved most of the things we want to achieve with Composition API. But Options API is probably going to be here to stay for as long as we know.
That's a good one, because like that's definitely one of the big questions. It also came up in the last weeks before the recording here. Like there was a bit of social media drama about like, oh yeah, composition API versus options API. Here we go again. And of course, people were like, okay, will the options API stay? Like you said multiple times it will. You also made it clear on Twitter. But like, is there like an end of life at some point planned for the options API? Or will it probably around for years to come, or even quote unquote forever?
The cost of keeping Options API around is like very, very low, because there's literally no maintenance burden for it nowadays. Like it's just a really thin layer that's on top of composition API. Like all the bugs we fix, it applies to both API styles pretty much. So yeah, I don't really see, like, there's no reason for us to remove it, other than I think even if we want to encourage people to use composition API, we will do so by just tweaking the documentation. Like one thing that we acknowledge is that I've heard this from some people who've recently picked up Vue, and they're pretty advanced developers. So their primary question is, when they first look at the documentation, they see the API style toggle.
Yeah.
And naturally, they want to understand how both API works, because they want to make an informed decision. But unfortunately, that just creates this extra mental overhead. Like people hate having to make decisions when they first learning something. But we throw this big decision right in front of them at the very beginning. It's kind of off-putting to new users. I think at one point, we'll just have to be more opinionated and just like be the doc. Like we will assume a lot more things. Because right now, like we have to assume, do you use a build tool? Do you prefer Options API or Composition API? Like this just leads to all these different branches. It's a whole decision matrix. And that kind of blurs people, because I think most new users nowadays, especially when they try to compare Vue to other frameworks, for example, Svelte, it has only one default way of using it. That's with a build tool, right? So if people are comparing that, they're like, okay, Svelte just directly shows me the only way of doing things, but Vue gives me this like 4 different branches. Now I have to figure it out. And just kind of, creates a bunch of barrier they have to jump through before they get to know, oh, this is actually the happy place, But that takes time, right? Because when we first did Vue 3, the new documentation, I think having both Composition API and Options API in there is still definitely necessary. Like we kind of want to give them equal weight, equal treatment.
100%. I mean, there's so much content also still in the Options API, which is another thing. Like I personally like to know both APIs, not like for straight away jumping into development, but more like, okay, it's still good to see, there's an older resource about, I don't know, a certain library to use, certain pattern. And it's still good to see, okay, this is Options API, but I can still read it and transfer it over Composition API because I know both.
Yeah. I think like over time, like we will, unfortunately, we will always have these existing content that's created using like certain dialect. I think the most damaging part, the period where we shipped Vue 3, but we didn't have script setup. That's like between 3.0 and 3.2.
Yeah.
That was probably the most hurting period, where there were a lot of articles written online introducing Composition API, but it's using this whole like setup return syntax.
The verbose one, yeah.
Yeah, and some people using other frameworks during that period will be like, oh, let's check out Vue Composition API. And I see that, they'll be like, I don't know about that, right? So I think that's kind of a mistake on our side. We should have just like shipped with script setup straight away. But unfortunately, we kind of, again, didn't do that up front. In hindsight, we should have just maybe shipped Composition API with script setup from day one. But when people say, show me what a Vue component looks like, we'll show them the default. That's SFC with script setup, because we believe that is the most reasonable way for you to start a new application nowadays, given all the support, given all the ecosystem tooling and everything, and the maturity. So it's at a point where we can now recommend that as the default. So probably in the next year, we're going to do another revamp of the documentation and start to kind of be more opinionated on, like, if you're just getting started, this is the way of doing things. There's no decisions to make. When you get a bit more comfortable with this, you can then explore alternative options. We'll make you aware of those options exist. We'll still properly document them, but we want the default onboarding path to get rid of all those decision matrix and just like one straight way. And you get to something that you can like confidently say, now I know how Vue works. I can build something with it. And now I discover, okay, there are also all these other ways of doing it. But if I'm already happy with the default way, I probably don't even need to, spend too much brain trying to figure out whether I should even use them.
Yeah, and if it's not a lot of cost to keep the options API around, I think it makes sense for sure to keep it around, especially because of the whole spirit of Vue in keeping, you can just drop it in a script tag.
Yeah.
You can use the options API. That's a little
I think
simpler.
options API is still better suited for the drop in through a script tag case, right? That's also one of the big reasons we want to keep it around.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Maybe you've seen Justin Schrader's proposal saying like, hey, at some point maybe it would be good to like put the options API behind a flag. I mean, there's a compile time flag already, or compiler flag already saying, let's remove the options API fully to make the bundle even leaner if you really don't use it at all. Have you thought about that a bit more? And is that a way you could imagine pursuing, or maybe not, like in the future, like not tomorrow, of course?
Yeah, I think you can already do that today, right? It's really just a matter of flipping a boolean as the default. I think we'll need an RFC on that, probably. I'm personally leaning towards we probably can consider doing it in Vue 4. I think in a lot of things we do in Vue 4 that will be considered breaking changes, just really like changing how something works by default rather than changing the way it completely works. I think Vue 2 to Vue 3, the biggest issue in the breaking changes is a lot of them are kind of like these low-level changes where it makes it really difficult for automatic migration. But something like a configuration flag that changes the default value, or just like options that flips the value, these are extremely easy to migrate. So so breaking changes in Vue 4 were probably more along those lines. It's really just like we will also most likely have a version where you can say like turn a flag on like opting to all these individual. It's kind of like migration build, but much easier, more compatible. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. And I hope somebody will come up with the RFC just to see where things are going.
Mm-hmm.
And next up, we have Natalia Tepluhina, our first, let's say, live and in-person guest at the podcast. And she is sharing some thoughts from the perspective of like a big organization at one point adopting composition API and maybe struggles and hurdles and why the options API can still be interesting.
That might be a bit tricky. Also, Evan agreed that like the learning story for people coming to Vue is like, okay, we have these two APIs, and then you could technically even use this like composition API without script setup, which is probably not in the docs anymore, but still you could just use a setup function also for migration and so on. So what do you think could be like a solution to a better learning path for the users?
So I still think that it might be a good idea to separate it not with a toggle, but with separate subdomains maybe, or even completely separate documentation, where you choose and go this way. Because honestly, nobody wants people to combine two API styles in the same component. That's the worst outcome you can have. Unless it's migration, and even for migration, I would recommend, okay, you want to use certain API in this, you rewrite it all.
Yeah.
Don't do part options, part composition, because that's the best way to get lost in this component forever, and for reviewers too. So maybe separating, and maybe, I remember the discussion about eventually deprecating one of the things, but the point is there are many people around who like options API.
Yeah.
And you remember this huge thread on Reddit about that?
Also the video, the proposal of Justin, like everywhere, people had very strong opinions about lots of things. And in a way, like options API is some part of Vue's identity. Like it started with it. It's like, it is easy if you just use it as like maybe not a fully proficient front end. You just I need tiny pieces of front end. Why not going for that?
And it's also easy on the huge teams. Like when you have a bigger team, few hundreds engineer, it's a good idea to use options because you can look at the component and you have no idea who wrote it, but all the things are at the same places. It might sound as a really stupid argument, but trust me, when you have multiple merge requests to review every single day, you want to find things in the same places, to just quickly understand what's going on in someone else's code. That's the biggest problem. Like, composition is amazing, and it also gives you a lot of freedom, which is a benefit if you're developing your own project or you have a few colleagues and you all agreed on like this. For bigger ones, you will need to invent your own convention. Yeah. Otherwise, it will be really hard. And those conventions can be as silly as you want. I saw people grouping composition API just like options API. They literally have data, like methods, computed commands.
I also made a video about that, saying like, hey, folks, if you use composition API,
this is not the way, but like, it works for them. And if you want them to use something better, you need to propose the alternative convention, because no convention is the worst. People will be looking at each other's code and like, what is happening here? Yeah. So I think maybe the best way forward, maybe I'm just a bit too optimistic, is to actually offer this kind of convention very well explained. I'm sure not in the Vue docs, because this is not the responsibility. Yeah. It should be adapted to the project. But there should be some kind of the guide, like, okay, you have this kind of, how do you decide on your conventions? How do you shape your code so that everyone can understand? So composition API is the way to go. Like that, I think we all understand that it's kind of the future. There are libraries that only work with composition API.
Vapor mode coming up, also only with composition API.
Makes me a bit sad in terms because I will be behind. We still use Vue 2, and we will talk about that. And yes, that will be additional headache for me as principal engineer to invent the convention and agree this convention with everyone, because we have developer democracy, and this will be problematic. We'll fight for 6 months, probably over the convention only. But this is, I think, that it was the main point in Reddit discussions too.
Yes.
People want predictability from the code.
Yeah.
Options give them this predictability with some price. And this price being not the flexible code, like very opinionated grouping.
Yeah, I mean, like if you have a really big component in Options API, it's super tough to read. You might know where you find like your variables and like your computers, your methods.
But that's a problem of architecture too, right? You will need to split this component with composition API, or at least move logic to composables. It's easier.
Exactly.
But again, I think that we will need to answer this question in the documentation outside of it for the people who love Options API for its predictability and rigid structure. Like what can we offer them instead? How can they use the composition API and still keep the convention in place so they feel more comfortable with the code of the bigger team? So yeah, that's the problem to solve.
I mean, technically, as you said, you can structure it like the Options API eventually.
But you don't want to. You lose the flexibility again.
Exactly. But I also think if you like the composition API, like there are certain concepts that people were not aware of. Like what I was also showing in the video about inline composables. Like Evan did it in his first draft of like moving the Vue CLI thing over. But I have seen lots of projects in my day job, and I have seen no one using inline composables that way. Now, consulting is not, you don't see the most glamorous projects usually, of course. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be asked to help out. But still, it's super interesting that not that many people are like, okay, like in normal JavaScript, you write a function to like encapsulate your code.
And it's weird to me, because how many times did you write a method?
Yeah.
A method that is used in this component multiple times, not only for the side effects. Sometimes it's a method that does some calculation, right?
Exactly.
You pass a parameter, you do some data mapping, you return the value that you want. And it's exactly what composable can be doing too, if you work on more advanced level with reactive state.
Yeah.
Just put it there and use it. You don't need to create an additional file, put it there and import it to your component and just...
I think that the problem is a bit that like with the composition API, everybody praised, okay, you can now like share logic, and sharing is commonly like, okay, I put it in a file, I can use it everywhere, it's really cool. But it's a bit like overcorrecting, right? And I did the same. Like in the beginning of the composition, I was like, okay, cool. I can like add a composables folder, put my composable in there, and then I use it in one component. Wow. But just leaving it in there, and then like, okay, I call my composables, my reusable functions for that component, just like on the top. Maybe I pass in some state I get from other composables in there, or like say, okay, I have my V model bound to something that I pass in there. That totally makes sense. But making that connection, that took a little bit. And I hope that something like this, like more architectural patterns, like how to deal with certain scenarios, maybe there will be somewhere documented to have like a bit of, maybe something like a cookbook or best practices. Because
but it also takes the evolution of the framework. That's the
course,
point. You cannot try them from the start because it's really just your opinion.
Yeah,
right?
you don't know if people like it, would use it, if it makes sense in the project. You need a feedback, of course.
It comes naturally. Like, the more people use Vue 3, the more they come up with the same problem and some solutions.
Yes.
The more it's natural to then put it in a documentation, a guideline, a cookbook, because now we know, like, people use it, try it this way, try it that way. Now we know what is better, and we can bring it back to the documentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I also like this like symbiosis, like, hey, it's always a feedback loop, right? You do something, people use it, people complain about certain things, say, hey, we can improve this, or we use it that way, does it make sense?
And up next, we have Tim Benniks, who was one of the first guests on our podcast.
Yeah, this setup function thing, it's for me, it feels now, looking back, it's much nicer because we used to whack every prop in the data thing of options.
That was the space for
it. And it all became reactive, but it wasn't even needed, right? And so over time, it just got slower.
And back in time, you didn't really have a way to say this shouldn't be reactive. Like you could put it actually in top level of the other options, and then access it with $options dot whatsoever. As like
we've done things like that, like workarounds like that, and or in a mounted function, just put a var or something.
Yes,
We've done all the things. But the interesting thing is, like, because I've done all these bigger projects over time, as like from a junior to a lead of multiple projects, and when we started using Vue and we were teaching each other to do it well, we found our way of doing Vue. I think we had like 80% less bugs.
And up next, we have Joe Tannenbaum. He worked on Inertia.js, is working at Laravel straight away. And it's curious to hear someone who also came from the PHP ecosystem, like some other people, and thoughts about the composition API. But you still support the options API in Vue 3, I guess, with Inertia. So that doesn't matter which API you write, I guess.
Yeah, both are supported. So it doesn't matter. You can easily write either the options or the composition, and it'll work either way. Yep.
Sweet. But on that note, what do you prefer? Which of the two APIs? Personal question.
I feel like this is I like the composition API personally. I'm a big fan. I will say that in the beginning, I had to like force myself to do it a lot in order to like understand it and like grok it in a way that made sense to me and made it feel better. But one day it just clicked and I was like, oh, this is the way. I don't see any other way. This is so much better.
I think that sounds pretty typical of like getting over that initial hurdle, but then once you do, you're like, how can I ever go back?
Yeah,
I
if
agree.
It clicks, it clicks.
Are you not on the composition API side of the equation?
No, I totally am. I'm a big proponent of the composition API. And like, there are tons of discussions that I like. I think both Michael and I, we created tons of content around that, like options API versus composition API. We had Avenue on the podcast talking about that. We had other people from the Vue core team also on that. Tons of like Twitter and Reddit discussions. So yeah, I think the three of us are on the same line there. But there are still people, and I also understand it to some degree. So like options API is a way, because let's say big team, not everybody is like a front end expert. Some backenders have to write front end code and so on. It's like, okay, review is easy. Everything looks kind of the same. I don't have to think about abstractions and also guidance and structure. So I understand, even though I wouldn't touch the options API nowadays anymore if I don't have to.
Yeah, I just think it feels a little less magic and a little more like you're just writing JavaScript and it's working as intended. And I think that's what finally made it click, was that the magic layer is a little bit removed and you can just see like, oh, it's defined up here and I'm doing this and now it's showing up on my template. And it's just a lot more like A to B and a lot less like A to B to C to D, you know?
Yes, true. And with the script setup syntax, which is also the only way anyone should write a composition API, it's my hot take.
Thank you.
Like, actually, it's not even a hot take. Avenue as well said it. So like they made a mistake, quote unquote. That's like what hurt Vue 3 the most was really releasing the composition API without script setup, because just with a setup function, sure, for migration, okay, exception made, fine, but like without it, that macro is just so lengthy, it's so difficult to read, and without it, it's clean, it's wonderful, it's what we expect from Vue.
It's also the recommended path, right? It's what they
100%. And up next, we hear all about someone who wrote a lot of React, Svelte, and of course also Vue.js, especially on the side, from the one and only CJ Reynolds from Syntax FM and also from Coding Garden. So let's jump into what he really likes about the composition API in Vue.js.
Yeah, so I followed it from the early days. Like I remember releasing a video on Coding Garden where I used like a pre-release version of the composition. Well, I used the composition API when it was a separate library that you could pull in. And I showed like how it works. And I was like, this is potentially coming to Vue. But I've been a fan from the beginning, mainly because it's less boilerplate, right? Like you're not exporting an object with all of these sections. You can just pull in the things you need. And to me, that is in line with how most Vue code has been, which is like as little as possible to get the work done. And it's simple. But I think one of the issues is, and I've talked to a lot of people about it since, and I did a talk on the Vue composition API at Denver Script. And some of the feedback was like, isn't this just going to create like really messy code bases? Basically, it takes a certain amount of discipline to write it in a composable, or write it in a way that can be maintained as well. And it's super interesting to see. Like there are some people were telling me like at their company, they introduced the composition API and the developers would write comments, data. Methods computed. And so they're basically like recreating the options API with all of these composition functions.
Correct.
And so yeah, I think it's also it's a learning thing as well, because I've realized in my career, like architecting code in a scalable and maintainable way is a hard thing to do. And so if the framework isn't showing you how to do that, then a lot of developers aren't going to do that because they're going to do the minimum to get it done. So ultimately, I like it, especially when they introduced script setup. I think when they released it, it came out with script setup. But
it actually didn't. It was like in 3.1 or 3.2. Yes, sadly.
Okay. But I just remember seeing the RFC and I was like, this is it. Like basically, it's Svelte now. Like we no boilerplate at all. Just like write your code. And so that was really cool to see. But yeah, I understand people's reasons for not using it or not liking it, because like it can be hard. It definitely takes some practice and some work to know how to structure those composition APIs in a way that will be maintainable. But at the end of the day, I think it was a good change also potentially for React developers that are moving over to Vue, because it's not the same, but it has a similar feel in that you have these little functions like use effect or use state or all the things you're familiar with in React, but now you can use them inside of Vue.
Yeah, it's definitely closer to React hooks. That's true. I mean, there's even a chapter aligning, like explaining the similarities, let's say, and inspiration. But it's really funny to mention the comments basically replicating the options API structure, because I made a video like, I don't know, not half a year, even a bit longer, about exactly that. It's one of my most popular ones, of like organizing code with the composition API, because I really think if you use composition API and do that, then that like you, as you said, you replicated structure, why you should just group things by logical concern, say the code that belongs together logically and not by type, by like, oh, all the computers, all the state, that should go together. And another thing I see people not doing very often is what you do in a normal JavaScript or TypeScript file. You create functions, right? And people, when they use reactivity and like refs and computers, they put them next to each other, but they don't put them in extra function, because then like, okay, what should I do with that? So or they do that, they write a new file like in a composables folder and say use whatsoever.ts, and then they put it in there. But if it just lives in one component, just write a function at the very end of it, like you really like newspaper code style, and call it, use, message or whatsoever. Do your thing there, call it on the top, and you have a wonderful architecture and structure. If you can't fully split the component up even, right? That's also an option. But if you have a component that's like orchestrating a lot of things, then like these concern-based inline composables, they help a lot. And funnily, that was always how the composition API was imagined to be. And maybe you remember that screenshot with like that color, that the color blocks in the RFC of the composition API with like options API or composition API. And lots of people are like, oh yeah, can we get that at some time like unblurred? Technically it's not even important, but if you take the new file of the composition API that Evan rewrote for that RFC, it was like part of the Vue CLI. He even does that. He even used these like inline composables that says, okay, like the first 10 lines after the imports are like calling these functions in the bottom. So I think also there, it's just people were so used to options API and then like, oh, composables, we can share code now. Let's extract everything. It was a lot of overcorrecting. But also by now, I think that's way more clear. And as you said before, you need some guidance, you need some structure, some architectural patterns as well to actually make the composition API work well, as in like not writing spaghetti code. And there one could also say like, yeah, skill issues, like we had before, which is in a way, it's kind of fair. I still think it's worth to put in that effort to make the composition API work. Also because it's the future, and also because there are a lot of shortcomings in the options API that were resolved, right? Especially TypeScript. But of course, also sharing logic, less magic, even less this dot whatsoever. So it's nice that it's there.
Yeah, I think that was the other big thing. Like last thing you mentioned is this dot. So seeing this dot all over the place in the component built with the options API, it felt like, I don't know, it felt like OOP. It was like, well, what is this? Do I have to worry about it? And so, yeah, it's really simplified things to be able to, you have these nice little functions. Everything is available within that scope. You don't have to worry about this. But I completely agree. I think it's, ultimately, I think if there, and maybe you've created this like a place of a lot of examples of how things can be structured, that will help a lot of people. Because I know a lot of programmers that get onboarded to a new code base, they potentially try to follow the patterns that they see in the code base already. And so if they can see, oh, this is a good example of how I can use the composition API effectively, and oh, I don't have to pull out everything, because it can go in both directions. You can like refactor too hard and now like all your stuff is in other files and it's hard to find, or you don't refactor at all and now it's all just in one component. And so because it's up to the developer, yeah.
And I've seen both in like code bases that do consultancy mainly, besides content creation and the podcast and so on. It's like I've seen people, with like 1,000 lines of scripts set up, and I've seen people with like, okay, I have 100 composables each in their own file, and they're only just used in one component. So it actually can go both ways.
Yeah. So hopefully like there's more examples out there and people can like learn better ways of doing it. I don't know if the docs potentially has anything like that, but that's the one piece that I think is hard for a lot of people. And like I've met people as well that use Vue that were like, I'm not even going to use the composition API because it's just too messy. Like I need the, or not too messy. Like the structure. I need structure. And so they stick with the options API.
At this point in the podcast, you might be wondering, does everyone love the composition API, or are there people who actually like the options API? Well, you are correct in wondering that. And our next speaker, our next guest, Simone, has a differing opinion, and he shares it in this upcoming clip.
I think the composition API, the way it's being used, was a mistake. Like, I really don't like it. And my explanation is that I really, really like it to create reusable functions. So for creating composable, I think that was precisely what was needed. And we've seen this with the Vue use from Anthony Fu. That repo is the Bible of Vue.js. Like without that repo, you cannot develop. But then I don't think creating actual components, so UI component with the composition API has made the overall development cleaner. More importantly for me, is made it harder for people to enter into the Vue ecosystem. It was easier to teach people with the option API than it is now to teach it with the composition API.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think I'd agree with that. If there is a way to use, you can use composables from Vue use with the options API in your components.
Yeah.
Which is nice that you can have the best of both worlds there. If you want to, you can use options API and then get that reusability. But then now you're looking at two different ways of writing your logic versus just the one.
Well, depends how we look into it. Because if we just think composable as mixins, you say, oh, you're just creating reusable logic, and then you just import them in your component, and component are always with option API. you don't think of it as two different ways. But again, I know that I'm alone. Unfortunately, I'm alone in that world.
Well, no, okay. I want you to stay strong in your opinion, because
will. Don't worry.
We need people who are like, we need like debate and like healthy
Correct.
back and forth. And I think it's not wrong that,
correct,
lots of people like the composition API, but it's, we don't want,
yeah. And funny enough, I like to be vocal when my decision is different from the rest of the world, because I want people to know that it's okay. So if you go on Twitter, it's very clear. I always like to tell people things that I don't know, but I don't complain. I like to give my explanation and why I don't like it and say it, because many times people just say, oh yeah, this is cool. And they join a train just to look cool themselves. But deep inside, they probably felt more confident or comfortable with the other version, but they will, feel like they have to say that it's cool because everyone else is saying it's cool. So I like to really give, show everyone else that you can't say no.
And I think the imposter syndrome is part of that too, because if everyone is saying the composition API is amazing, and Evan says this is probably the way you should be writing it, and everyone who has a platform on Twitter or up on stage is saying composition API, every example is composition API, and you're thinking, wow, I really just don't get it. Why can't I just write with the options API? Then it's easy to feel like you don't belong, or you're missing something, or you're not smart enough to get it, or you're not a good enough developer to understand why it's better. But you know what? There's different opinions on everything. In our podcast with Sumit, we did actually a 2-part episode of that, and he focuses a lot on the business value of software development. And so his take on composition API versus options API is a little bit different than some of the other guests.
So yeah, everything new is that. We also just recently enabled TypeScript, so optionally, of course, but we start to type new stuff. We start to bring the types from the API to the front end, which is a great thing. Even for me, as someone who would have never, ever done this, I would never have done this, but I know the benefit, I see the benefit, and I'm looking forward when we are there. So we are slowly getting there, and I'm getting more familiar with the composition API as well. So I'm warming up to it. Me personally, my team loves it, but it's not everything is like we try to rewrite or change only what's necessary to make it work. So most of the code is still options API, and yeah, but especially new components are composition API. And we did it in the beginning. We had, what was the Vue composition RP package or something?
Yeah,
so we used the composition.
API.
Yeah, we used that a lot. But there was also a problem for the migration because you had to change stuff and this was not supported anymore. And,
Yeah, so I mean, it's good that you didn't just say, hey, all components, let's move them all over, because obviously that would probably be even more work for, and as you said before, no tangible results. Okay, they're composition API now, but now what? Are they faster? Well, that 1 millisecond, it doesn't really matter. I really like the Boy Scout principle there in terms of if you touch a component, if you have to implement something, then maybe it's good there to migrate it over if it's not 3,000 line component, which theoretically shouldn't exist, but we all know that can happen every now and then, or a big page component. So that totally makes sense. And because otherwise, migrations with 150 lines of 100,000 lines of codes, they would take forever and ever.
And also, again, the question is also why migrate them over, right? I don't know if the options API is suddenly bad. I haven't read about it. I only know why the composition API exists, and if these benefits or the downsides of it are, either not important to you or you want to avoid them, then I don't know. The options API is still valid as far as I know, but I see many people advocating for it, and some of the benefits still have to emerge in my head, but other people are seeing it. And this is the only thing I can think of where I thought maybe even is wrong on this one. But he's much smarter than me, so I'm sure I will see the benefit at some point that he is. And what I usually know from these front end or from programming in general, solutions like libraries and frameworks, etc., you understand them best if you experience the pain that they solve. And I probably haven't experienced the pain that the composition API is solving for me. Not yet, at least. And at some point I will get there, I'm sure, and I will get it. And again, I'm warming up to it. It's much, much easier, in my opinion, or much more pleasant to use it with the script setup tag instead of having setup as an option. This is something where when it's mixed, it's really painful with the return and everything. And we have a lot of mixed components as well, and they are painful. So that should not. And we only have this mixed components because of libraries like TanStack Query that only support that. Right. While we were using async data a lot because it's great when you do server-side rendering and have stuff pre-rendered and pre-fetched. But now it doesn't work anymore, and we introduced this new framework and TanStack Query, and then you need to use the setup, and it's just, it's very messy. But again, new components are very clean. They all use the composition API, and when you use script setup, it's much more pleasant, simply because you don't have to return this. You can structure it a little better. Just today, I was working on something and I was refactoring something, and I liked that I immediately saw that, every function, every computed prop, I saw that if it's not used in the template, my IDE shows it to me, things like that. And I know there are many more benefits that I just haven't experienced yet, especially with TypeScript, especially with using composables more.
Definitely.
That my team is very proficient in. They use this all the time. I personally have never abstracted anything into a composable yet because I wasn't I always thought, adding something into a composable means I want to reuse it. And I couldn't warm up the idea of putting something in a composable just to structure it differently. Having not 1,000 lines of code in one component, but putting it into a different file via a composable. I haven't warmed up to this idea yet. And just scrolling through a large component feels a lot more messy in the composition API because the code is mixed. You can structure it by topic, but it's how do you structure it with a code comment? I put code comments in. This is the logic for this. This is the logic for this. It doesn't look more structured than the options API in my for my eyes.
Let's quickly stay there because I think that's really good. Because I heard it quite often, and actually what a lot of people coming from options API are what they're doing is writing / props / data and so on.
But really, okay, I haven't thought about that.
Please don't ignore what I just said. But what would you do in a normal JavaScript or TypeScript file, not Vue, just in some API route or so? You probably would create a function, right? Hey, this is code that belongs together, same concern. You put it in a function, and now if you say, hey, this is code that has some stateful logic, right? It also belongs to one concern. You can also put it in a function, and then you put a use in front, and it's a composable, but you don't have to put it in a new file. And that's what Michael and I usually call inline composables. So you keep them in a component, you don't have to reuse them. And it's a bit like functions in JavaScript and TypeScript.
Okay, that's a good idea. I wasn't thinking about inline composables at all yet. And I will actually do that. I have a large component right now that is a composable API, and it has waypoints with observers, then it has drop-down logic, then it had blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. I will try this.
Next up, we have Jakub Andrzejewski, whose name I definitely didn't butcher here. We talked a lot about security of Vue and Nuxt applications, but also about the options and the composition API. Here are his thoughts.
At first, I wasn't really into Vue 3 and the composition API. I was a huge fan of options API, and I really liked this interface. And I thought that the composition API reminds me too much of React. But honestly, when I started developing with it, I felt instant boost in productivity in terms of the things that I can do that basically work, and I have to do less work to make it work. In general, the new approach seems to be something that makes me more productive, especially if you join it or merge it with some great tools by Antony Fue, such as the auto imports, for example. This is one of my favorite things in web development is when you have the same result, but you have to write less amount of lines of code.
And it's still readable, right?
Perfect. It's still readable. It still works. It still handles some conflicts. So it doesn't mean that it will break. It handles conflicts smoothly. So kudos to Anthony for that and many other projects he built.
And next up, we have Rijk van Zanten, who's not only the founder and CTO of Directus, but also a big fan of the Composition API. I guess let's hear what he has to say about the Options API and Composition API there, and why he maybe bet on quite early on it.
And it was just because I believed in the APIs of it that much that I was looking at the Composition API in those very early days, and I was like, this is such a tremendous improvement over the Component API that or the Options API. I keep forgetting.
Yes.
I don't know why.
Haven't used this for so long.
I guess that's really why. It also had never had a name until it became the old thing, and then it had a name all of a sudden.
Fair.
I guess I call it the Object API just because anyways, doesn't matter.
It's a big object.
It was just a giant object.
But let's just stop real quick there, because I think that's super interesting. So you straight away had the hunch of like, okay, Composition API, like it's miles better than the Options API. Why?
It was because you can organize the file itself by sort of logical grouping instead of what it's for. So in the Options API, to write it down. On the Options API, everything was grouped by the type of thing that it is. So all of your computers were in the same block, in the same property. All your methods are in the same property. All your data props are in the same. Your what you would call refs now are in the same block. Your props are in the same block. That, it makes sense conceptually, but at the same time, once you have bigger components or just more complicated workflows, or God forbid, you want to share methods between components, that gets tricky pretty quick. And we noticed the same with some type safety things as well, because of, to access all the data, you would go this.data, blah, blah, blah. That also meant that sort of getting TypeScript to work well into that mix in those days was basically, you could kind of with some pain and suffering, but it really wasn't worth the effort yet, right? So the Composition API sort of removed a lot of those pain points, because now I could group my files by, okay, here's everything that has to do with sort of this responsibility, and just get all the refs and all the computers and all of the methods just in the same vibe, in the same part of the file. And it also helped that it became a little bit less opinionated again, funnily enough, or in the sense that it's I'm catching myself in the funny irony that I said earlier that it was more opinionated. That's a good thing, but it did mean that you didn't have to go searching through like a this dot chain to find some data, because you had a variable that you defined yourself, and that's the thing that you're talking to. So I think from a mental model, that sort of simplified things a little bit.
I would say that just became a bit more JavaScript again.
It became a bit more JavaScript-y. Yeah. Oh, exactly. And that just took it one step closer to the sort of, it is just HTML, JavaScript, and CSS with a bunch of utility functions that you can use to make it even better. Like that's kind of the feeling that it raised, which was just, I felt like right at home. And at the same with Pina, like Vuex was really good for what it did. But at the same time, the model of like you're defining an action, and that then runs a mutation that goes into a store, and then that sort of updates somewhere, and then you pull the data out. And it's like the mental model of that. And I had the same with Redux in the React land way back in the day, which had a similar mental model. And it was always just a bit tricky, because I'm like, it's just JavaScript. Just let me update a variable. What are we doing here? So when, the very, very earliest thoughts about Pina came out, that it was like, this is literally just a ref like I would use in my own components, but in a separate file. Well done.
There we go.
High fives all around. High fives all around. This is all I need. Yeah. This is all I want.
In my conversation with Eduardo a few months ago, we talked about Pina and a whole bunch of other things, but we also talked about the Composition API. So up next, you'll hear his thoughts on that. And so the question is, okay, we've got these like three main ways of doing state, and how do we know when to use which one? Like, when should we be using Pina versus just using a couple refs versus creating a composable? Or how do you think through this problem yourself? Maybe there isn't like a single answer or a best practice, but like at least just like take us through your thinking on that.
Yeah, there isn't a single answer. And the reason is because you have people who work different ways and they like to organize their thoughts in different ways. And the composition API makes things very freestyle. That's not the correct way to say in English, but you are really free to organize the code however you want. And that has its good parts and its bad parts. I think it has been covered in other episodes with Evan Yo. So Pinia, when you use the setup stores, which I will really encourage people to use most of the time because they are really more powerful and flexible, you really have something that looks like a composable. And that's very intentional, right? Like I want that to feel as close to Pinia as possible because you can reuse all the patterns and the knowledge that you already know. And you're not really wasting your time learning. So you cannot say, oh, but maybe this disappears later on, and then I will have learned something that I will never use, because that's not the case. Yeah. I think another thing that maybe helps some people click is that when we look at stores with the options API, so state, actions, and getters, they're so simple that it doesn't come off as something very flexible or something where you can have a service. And so when you start using setup stores, because you have the full flexibility of just a function and returning whatever you want, until you don't do that, you don't get to see the full picture of what you can do. And so I have this talk that is called Disaster Class Pinia. I think you've probably seen it in person, or you were there. But it talks a little bit about this, and I say at some point that I like to see stores are composable singletons with SSR support. So it's like a composable where you have the full power of a composable, but it only happens once too. There are like tons of ways of using Pinia, and I know sometimes it's just the lazy way. And this is when it's just the lazy way, it's probably not the good tool, right? You could use just a ref sometimes. Also, if you don't have SSR, right, you can use a global ref and it works well. Although I wouldn't recommend that because you never know. You move to Nuxt, you move to server-side generation. We get into the complexities of web development too.
Well, I think it's an interesting point about the being lazy, because I think that's a lot of things are affected by that. So when Evan was on talking about composition API and options API, he also mentioned that with the composition API, it's better, but only if you're actually thinking through your stuff. And if you're going to be lazy about it, then it can end up with this mess. Whereas the options API, it forces you to have some minimum level of discipline in how things are organized. And so I think, and even you could probably look at any tool or any library, and if you're lazy with it, then it ends up working poorly for you. And just because you have Pinia doesn't mean you can't just stop thinking about what you're doing, In November, Alex and I had the honor to host a panel at VueConf Toronto, and the discussion was wide-ranging, covering a number of different topics, but one that we made sure to get in there at the end was what different people thought about the composition API.
Let me do it the other way around. It's a little bit of ping pong. Options API or composition API?
Composition.
Really?
Composition.
Yeah, composition.
This isn't a question. Composition.
So now you've seen all of our guests that have given opinions on composition API and options API. Maybe you have your own opinion. Maybe you share your opinion with lots of these others. But if you enjoyed this, then go and check out some of the other content that we've got. We've got plenty of episodes if you want to take a look. If you've got some downtime on the weekend, in the evening, maybe while you're working even, go check out those episodes. We've got, I think, 40, 41, 42 at this point. I'm losing count.
Not too many, still some coming. And of course, we also want to know what you prefer. Is it composition API? Is it options API? Let us know on the socials, like on Blue Sky. Let us know in the comments, of course, on Spotify or YouTube. We'll check them all, respond to them. And, well, of course, you can also guess our opinions in terms of composition API or options API. At least if you listen to all the episodes and that little supercut here. So yeah, looking forward to see you in the other episodes. Michael said the next stuff as well. There are a lot more coming every week. And we have some amazing guests lined up, so can't wait for that. And of course, hope you all enjoyed a few more quiet and relaxed days.